So I'm Liz Egling. I'm the Occupational Therapy Program Coordinator for Sensory Integration.
I'm Robin Seeger. I'm an OT at Broomfield.
And we're here to talk today about the neurological foundations of AIRS SI relating to theory and practice. The goals of our presentation are to give you guys an overview of foundational assumptions of the theory and related neural constructs. We also want ourselves to understand the difference between a hypothesis and a theory and why that's important, and that's going to help us be able to advocate for traditional SI theory and practice by having strong knowledge about its origins. This will also lay the path toward consistent use of terminology through expanded understanding of these foundational constructs and continually emerging evidence. And we're also going to identify follow-up priorities for this phase of the partnership program, which we're going to review later. We believe that it's important for all of us to understand the underlying neurologic foundations of the presenting issues you might see in the child who you are treating with SI issues. And I wanted to mention, send me your sign-in sheets, make sure you sign in, and keep those for DORA and NBCOT, and then also attach your PowerPoint to that information when you're submitting, if you want credit for this for continuing it.
If you got the email message about how to print out the notes version of this presentation, you're going to have plenty of this information written out for you as we speak, so hopefully there won't be too much around note-taking. So we're on slide 2 now, if you're not seeing it properly. Why is it important that we understand neural foundations for sensory integration practice? One of the primary reasons for that is the evidence for AIRS SI theory, her scientific theory, was found in neuroscience and educational psychology. That's point one. The second reason we need to be able to understand these things is to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and at least a bit of the evidence for its effectiveness. And most importantly, we need to have an understanding of neural foundations to help us select appropriate assessments and interpret them properly, and the reasoning for that is to be able to design effective interventions. If you look in your notes area, don't snore, but I wanted to remind you where this comes from, and one of the reasons I think AIRS is considered to be so unique in occupational therapy is how much she brought around science to our practice. And that's basically what her work was around sensory integration theory. She developed a whole theory that was attempting to explain the association between mild neurologic deficits and mild learning deficits. And to do that, she wasn't just making wild guesses, and that's where this terminology question comes into play. When we think about theory and hypothesis in everyday usage, we're thinking about guesses and suppositions. But in science, even hypotheses are based on evidence. People don't just make wild guesses. They're putting information together. A hypothesis just explains a narrower range of information, whereas a theory tries to encompass a broader understanding of several hypotheses, perhaps. Can you guys hear? We have a meeting in the next room. Is everything clear? Thumbs up? Okay, looks good. So I specified the definitions of those things in your notes view. I'm not going to go through it now. I just kind of summarized that. Again, the experimental evidence for AIRS theory of sensory integration dysfunction was found in neuroscience and educational psychology. And I think I've gone through the rest of these things already, so we can move on to the next slide.
So this is a general overview that I'm going to give you of the nervous system divisions and the functions of each. You think about 3 components of the nervous system, the first being the central nervous system, second being peripheral nervous system, and the third being autonomic. The ANS, or autonomic, and PNS, peripheral, transmit messages to and from the central nervous system. First, looking at the CNS, so that's made up of neurons, pathways, and glia. You're thinking about brain and spinal cord with that. And then from there, the peripheral nervous system is made up of receptors and neurons, and that's your skeletal muscles and glands connecting to the central nervous system. So that's your connection to the outside world. And the third one being the autonomic nervous system, which is automatic, that controls your protective and homeostatic functions. So if you think about sympathetic division of the ANS, that prepares your body for fight or flight. And then the parasympathetic division has the rest and digest function. So if you think about these two, these tie in tremendously when you're talking about sensory modulation disorders, because say you have tactile defensiveness, that's your sympathetic system kicking in, and then you provide deep pressure input, and then that's your parasympathetic division being activated. And you can look at the next slide here, and your notes view will have another picture, but this is kind of a picture diagram of everything I just explained. So you can see in the top view, there's your somatic and autonomic nervous system falling under that nervous system picture, and then your CNS is your brain and spinal cord. And then when you think about what's happening when, say, you feel a pinprick, so first that sensory information is sent to the sensory afferent division, you can see in the below picture. That information is then sent to the peripheral nervous system, and then sent to the central nervous system, interpreted, and then the PNS again sends that back out, so you've got the motor response. If it's somatic, in the case of voluntary movement, you're going to pull your arm away. If it's a internally driven or involuntary activity, then you've got your sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions reacting. In the nervous system, there's a closed loop system of sensation, decision, and reactions.
Okay, well, the central nervous system is functionally organized in both a hierarchical manner or top-down, and also heterarchically, haven't said that word before, which is just to illustrate the organization on a systems or network level. So your central nervous system has several divisions. There's the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. The cerebrum is also known, consists of the cortex and the limbic system. The cortex, as you all know, is highly specialized, analyzes and integrates precise details of sensory information. So think about the homunculus of the somatosensory cortex that has that body representation in a sensory manner of that's part of cerebral function, very detailed. And then in your parietal lobes, you have associative and integrative functions happening where different types of information is put together. The cortex is considered to be your command and control center and is especially important in descending inhibition for focused behavior. And anybody who's worked in the area of autism, sensory integrative dysfunction, modulation disorders, this is one of the things that's consistently brought up and often talked about as executive function. That's one of the big functions of the cerebrum. The limbic system consists of the basal ganglia, amygdala, hippocampus, and cingulate gyrus, and is responsible for control of emotion, memory, and arousal. Some of those things will be looked at more when we talk about modulation, which we're not doing today. The diencephalon is the next level down, and that consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And thalamus is a major relay and integration station. It receives sensory information, sorts it out, and relays input from the peripheral nervous system and the optic nerve to the cortex. The hypothalamus is a little bit more involved with processing of primitive information, things like emotion and body states such as hunger and thirst. It's very involved in maternal-infant bonding and motivation, and regulatory functions through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And again, that'll probably be addressed more when we do the lecture on modulation. Next level down is your brainstem, which is medulla, pons, and midbrain. This area is responsible for some basic physiologic homeostasis functions such as managing blood pressure, breathing. It's also responsible for the control of your face and neck muscles through the cranial nerves, and it's very involved in arousal and alertness, your reticular activating system in particular. The other function that the brainstem serves is quite a bit of filtering and integration. If you remember your details of neuro, there are several nuclei in this area, and large nuclei are usually a place that lots of information comes together from diverse sensory systems sometimes, and sometimes single systems. So there's a very strong filtering, integration, and relay function in the brainstem as well, and very closely tied to the cerebellum and the limbic system, as well as the cortex. The cerebellum, as you guys know, is very responsible for control of posture and coordination of movement, so responsible for timing and sequencing and refinement of motion. That's learned through practice as well as new motor learning. The cerebellum is also connected to areas of the cortex that are very involved in language and cognitive function. What was that? Did you guys?
We just had some feedback.
Okay. I saw an abstract on a study recently that I thought was really interesting about cortical implants, and its conclusion was that one of the most predictive factors for success with cortical implant is functioning of, I believe it was the left hemisphere of the cerebellum. Cochlear, I'm sorry, what did I say? Cortical, not cortical. I wish we could do that. Cochlear.
Wow.
Give me a new one.
I'm really out of it.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I just thought that was fascinating. You know, Liz is doing work with cochlear implant kids up here and doing kind of the motor component of their group, and it just shows how important sensory motor integration is to so many higher level functions. So general functions of note for the central nervous system, spinal cord, of course, we don't talk about a lot, but it's critical for relay of information from the periphery, but also has some basic functions such as spinal locomotion. There's thought to be central program generators in the spinal cord for basic motor functions and then for processing of spinal reflexes. General functions of note around the central nervous system, and these are really things that Ayers talked about, and as we move along in our ability to do better research, there's more evidence mounting that these things are in fact true. The lower centers of the nervous system are more diffuse and primitive and less specialized, and thus potentially have a more pervasive influence on function. The lower centers are responsible for filtering and refining of sensory information before relaying it to the cortex, and so they have a sort of responsibility, if you will, for relaying well-organized information for the cortex to operate on. The cortical centers depend on lower centers for receipt of essential well-organized sensory information. Ayers posited that critical aspects of sensory integration occur at lower levels, especially the brainstem and the thalamus, and that increased efficiency of processing at these lower levels enhances higher order functioning. This is very different from a very top-down view of neural organization that was held in her day and still is very much now, that the newer parts of the brain were more in control and responsible, and that when there was a problem, that's where the problem came from. Most of vestibular processing takes place in the brainstem, and most of somatosensory, which is tactile and proprioceptive processing, takes place in the thalamus. Okay. This next slide is very busy, and I don't intend to go through all these details. It's really just to show you that there is a lot of complexity and redundancy in how sensory information is received, encoded, integrated with other sensations, honed or inhibited in order to focus a message. And some of this happens peripherally, most of it happens centrally. I think the primary messages that I want you to be taking from this slide are on the second page of your notes, and that's the fact of sensory information being processed in two ways, and I'm going to really simplify this. This is kind of how I talk to families about it. One way your nervous system processes sensation is for its detail. That's epicritic or discriminative processing. Information from the periphery goes through the DCML, it goes through the thalamus, and is primarily then relayed to the somatosensory cortex, the frontal lobe, and occipital lobe. And all sensory systems except smell have this epicritic route. This route does not pass through the limbic system. This is your discriminative sensory processing that gives you good body percept on which you can plan movement. So this is what is very much responsible for your adaptive interactions with your environment. The other way your nervous system processes sensation is for its value. There's a valuation or a protocritic. When I was in school, it was called protopathic processing of sensory information. These are simplified. We're not going into high detail in terms of how the information is carried through the nervous system, but basically this sensory information comes from the periphery, goes through the anterolateral system, through the brainstem, and then is processed through limbic structures, so that emotion and regulatory function happens there. It's not filtered by the thalamic relay. It's mostly responsible for regulation. There's two processes that occur in that system. One is the evaluation of, is this input safe or dangerous? If it's dangerous, fight-flight reactions are mobilized, although your autonomic or your sympathetic system, it functions continually, and you don't go over into fight-flight until you reach a tipping point. The other function of this protocritic system is relevance. So I've determined whether we've got safety or danger. The next thing I need to figure out is, do I need this information or not? And if I don't need it, I'm going to habituate it and stop processing it. This is a system that's implicated when we have kids with sensory modulation disorders.
And can I just say one thing?
Yes.
And it can vary. It can.
Yes.
That can be different from day to day, time to time.
Yes. And again, we'll go into more detail with that in the modulation lecture.
Okay, so then looking next at SI theory and assumptions, this is from chapter 1 of the Bundy book for reference. The first assumption is that the central nervous system is plastic through the lifespan. So when you think about structural change like neuroplasticity, comparing that to learning or adaptive change in behavior, and that means that brain structures can change throughout the lifespan. Ayres originally stated that this key period was 3 to 7, but since then has been changed. It's now you can learn through the lifespan and adapt. The second assumption is that sensory integration is a developmental process to promote more complex behavior. And the third, brain functions as an integrated whole. So a lot of this is, like Robin mentioned, occurring subcortically and contributing to development of higher order function. The fourth assumption is adaptive interactions are critical to SI. They promote and are reflective of sensory integration. And then the fifth is that people have an inner drive to develop sensory integration through participation in sensory motor activity. Therefore, less inner drive reflects SI dysfunction.
So we're going to take each one of those Ayres SI theory assumptions and go into a little bit more detail on it. So neuroplasticity is an enormously important construct, and in Ayres' time was considered more of a theory. And it's really, simply stated, it's the ability of the brain structures to change. In Ayres' time, she hypothesized that intervention derived from SI theory could affect changes in the brain due to this phenomenon or this process of neuroplasticity. And she was talking about permanent changes in brain structure, which was, considered pretty out there, but this was not based on just a guess. It was based on systematic observation and an understanding of the literature. She discussed the effect of the interaction with the environment on brain development, structure, and function. So that was a hypothesis for her. But in Ayres' time, there was less ability to really look dynamically at the nervous system in motion, if you will, or as it functions. And we really have a lot of imaging techniques now that have allowed neuroscientists to look at this more closely. And neuroplasticity is really considered to be a law of neural function now versus a hypothesis or a theory. It even puts to question whether there's a difference between that first bullet in the Ayres assumptions that discriminates between neuroplasticity, which leads to structural change, versus learning, which is considered a change in behavior. Studies are looking at neuroplasticity as a foundation for learning. Connections are constantly happening and being pruned back, and learning intermittently may be a function of neuroplasticity as well. Let's see. So nowadays, when you Google a definition of neuroplasticity, no matter what the source is, all include the idea that neuroplasticity is dependent on interaction with the environment, that this change requires that environmental interaction, which, as I said before, was kind of more of a hypothesis or part of Ayres' assumptions in her theory. So she was really ahead of her time in understanding that. Liz already talked about the age, and we know that plasticity continues through the lifespan, so we can still learn, thank goodness.
Okay, so then looking at the second assumption, which is that SI is a developmental process. This involves that the brain is immature at birth, and this is simply and obviously observed in motor language and communication. The brain is also immature or dysfunctional in some individuals with learning problems. And if you remember, Ayers was trying to find a link between learning and behavior in her studies. So that's kind of why that part is written there, looking at observable differences in sensory motor function to indicate learning problems. And then the third, behavior present at each stage in development provides the foundation for development of more complex behaviors. So thinking about, again, this is from that Bundy chapter 1, development is a spiraling continuum. So when you have one skill, it's going to help you develop the next skill, and you're using strategies from the previous learned skill to attain that. And then if you think about how does this apply with the kids you might see. So if a child has baseline vestibular and proprioceptive and visual challenges, then you're going to see an outcropping of challenges with posture, and then maybe this use of high guard positioning, which then means that they look more clumsy, they have difficulty with bilateral coordination, hands to midline, kind of looking like a bilateral integration and sequencing deficit. So that's kind of describing that continuum of learning and behavior. The bottom to top development focus of the foundational systems tying in with difficulties learning lead to focus on vestibular and somatosensory or tactile and proprioceptive systems. And PET scans have also shown support for bottom to top development, which is one of the reasons why Ayers spent so much time focusing on this lower level function.
So when another assumption is that when sensory integration dysfunction occurs, normal development is disrupted. And I had the opportunity to really see this in kind of the extreme in a little girl that I've seen recently who came to me at 15 months of age for feeding delays. She wasn't transitioning to solids well, and when I first saw her, she wasn't sitting, she wasn't rolling, she had delayed writing reactions, severe tactile defensiveness. She couldn't move her head. In supine, she looked terrified, and if you moved her head, she would fuss. So we started treating the underlying vestibular and proprioceptive dysfunction right away. And she had been receiving physical therapy through early intervention and hadn't really been making much progress. She could be propped in sit, and she'd sit in high guard and stiffen her knees, and she wasn't moving. And last time I saw her last week, she's starting to crawl. I've seen her about 10 to 12 visits, something like that. And my hypothesis is very poor vestibular and proprioceptive function, and parents have told me that they both have problems with movement sensation. So just a really striking and interesting case of a child with really severe sensory processing problems. And if you look at your notes, Mom's a pediatrician. They went down every medical avenue to try to find something wrong with this little girl. She will probably receive diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which absolutely does not rule out that there's a sensory integrative problem. If any of you guys are staying up on that literature, just really has been fun to see this little girl. It's been a while since I saw a little one.
Yeah, Robin. Okay, so then a lot of you guys have seen this next diagram, but this is talking about the brain functioning as an integrated whole and looking hierarchically. I cannot speak. So that's looking at, we're starting at the bottom, those foundational sensory areas then lead to tying up to academic learning at the very top. Sensory integration is occurring mainly in the subcortical areas, the tactile, vestibular, proprioceptive systems, and then the lower brain structures develop and mature before higher level structures. Development and optimal functioning of those higher order structures is dependent on development of the lower order structures. So if you think about something like handwriting at the top end, how could that tie in with baseline challenges at the bottom end? That's why it's important to test every area when a child comes in, not just looking at, okay, their fine motor skills, but you need to look at everything: balance, praxis, bilateral coordination, postural control, all that. And then, so basically with this viewpoint, there has been significant criticism because it's basically led to a oversimplifying way of looking at how learning is happening to the point of minimizing it. And so there has been some criticism looking at this bottom-up approach.
There are points made in several of the readings that we're giving you that Ayers purposely simplified some of the some of her assumptions to try to illustrate very complex constructs or neural phenomenon, and that she also was thinking not just linearly, but in a systems way, if you look further into her readings. One of her contemporaries, Pribram, was a neuroscientist at the time that Ayers was doing her writing, and this quote comes from him: the essence of biological hierarchies is that higher levels of organization take control over as well as being controlled by lower levels. And he talked about reciprocal causation. And that goes back to some of the assumptions we talked about earlier, that the cortex and the lower systems don't work separately. They influence each other, and you can have problems in one or both. The other thing that we know now is that sensory integration functions are actually distributed throughout the brain. The major integration centers for those sensory motor functions that we're the most focused on, vestibular especially and proprioception, are more brainstem level. But there are integrative processes that occur actually in the periphery as well. I saw another article recently that talked about integration of tactile and proprioceptive information in peripheral nerves. So just to make us all confused, that's out there now. So two other things around neural organization and the theories of neural organization. So when Ayers was doing her writing, the hierarchical view was actually new and kind of being discussed a lot. The next iteration that people talked about a lot is systems theory, and this is that idea of a functional neural organization is not hierarchical entirely in nature. It's very dynamic, and the cortex needs information from lower centers and vice versa. That theory talked about behavior being the end product of internal and external subsystems, sensory motor, cognitive, mechanical, and the task demands. That the individual and the central nervous system are open systems, which means that they can be influenced by external factors, and that they're capable of self-regulating and self-organizing and changing. Nowadays, people talk about networks of neural organization, and this actually is coming out of computational neuroscience. So if you look up neural organization or neural networks, you're going to find all kinds of computer stuff and artificial intelligence stuff. And that has been derived from trying to figure out how the brain works and how you can reproduce that artificially. It's similar to a systems theory, but it talks about networks of functional capacity, and they cross systems. Motor learning is another theory that's out there around neural organization, and the thing that really motor learning brings to us is that the demands of the specific task within the specific context lead to neural organization. That's not that far away from what Ayers talked about. All of Ayers' work was focused around purposeful activity because she's an OT. And adaptive responses, right. And what's very cool to see is the more that neuroscience begins to understand these things, the more foundation there is for occupational therapy practice. You'll see that in one of our next slides.
Okay, so then the next one is, the next assumption is that adaptive interactions are critical to SI. So adaptive interactions, that's an ongoing process, and that involves give and take with the environment in which an individual meets a challenge or learns something new and the environment changes, which means that you've met the task demands. Adaptive interactions promote sensory integration, and they also reflect it. And sensory integration is a spiraling process characteristic of an open system. We've talked about this. Learning requires recognition of success through effective feedback or production feedback of how it felt compared to outcome feedback of what was achieved. And then adaptive interactions plus recognition of success through feedback form the basis for the development of neuronal models, or kind of the memory so that you can learn. And if you think about that, adaptive in Ayers SI means that the actions completed need to be just a little bit harder than they've ever been before, and this is really important, that just right challenge. So for instance, if you have a kid come in and you find through testing that their praxis isn't great, and then you have them come in and you set up everything in the room for them, how does that meet their just right challenge? Thinking about how can I make this a little bit harder for them to where they can succeed at it, obviously not give up, but not doing everything for them. And this also really, you have to think about what's that internal drive of the child, how are you working with them? So it's not just a sensory motor activity like, okay, go complete jumping jacks. It's actually a back and forth kind of art that you're completing where they're engaging and you're working together and collaborating, which I think sometimes gets lost when we've been treating a while. I know myself, I'm guilty of that, where you start to just think about goals and less about that just right challenge and that drive that the kid has. You guys can read the other definitions there, but it gives definitions of production feedback arising from the body, and then outcome feedback, which is what happened based on me doing something that produces a change in the environment. So if you have increased learning going on, then you have increased synapses in the brain.
So did you read this last thing? The very last bolded statement on notes page 11. This is from neuroscience. This is not a theory. It's something that's been established through imaging. Neural activity associated with meaningful behavioral responses is most likely to promote synaptic modifications. That is the neuroscience evidence for the importance of the adaptive response and intrinsic motivation, which is so core to occupational therapy practice. You guys should be jumping up and down and saying, woohoo, I'm an OT.
Every day.
Yes. Oh, it's my turn. So speaking of inner drive, that was very critical to Ayer's theory of sensory integration, dysfunction, and intervention. She linked inner drive and motivation to self-direction and self-actualization, and she actually observed in kids with sensory integrative dysfunction, as Liz mentioned earlier, that they showed little of this inner drive to be active participants, to try new things, and to meet new challenges. And she hypothesized that, she didn't hypothesize, she observed that improvement from the intervention often appeared first in improved self-confidence and belief in the child's ability, and then they would engage more, and they achieved more satisfaction from their engagement. We heard in one of the early pilot studies when Lucy was here and she was interviewing parents about what their concerns were, that they weren't telling us about specific sensory problems. They were saying things about their child having very poor self-esteem and confidence, and that they didn't participate much. So, Ayers was right on that right from the beginning. Let's see. I like to think about, you'll often hear from parents or other folks who have concerns about these kids that, when it's something he wants to do, when he's motivated, he can do it, and when he's not, he doesn't, and take that in a very negative way to mean that the kid's just, being difficult. I like to think about motivation as, if you know about how old cars work, I don't know why I know this, it's just one of those fun facts to know and tell, but there's a distributor that tells the spark plugs to fire together, and that's what I think of as motivation. It's that thing that is getting everything to work together. It's not just that the kid's being difficult, it's that they need that. It's absolutely critical to get the integration of their systems so that they can have adaptive interaction with their environment. It's so important, and we should really be always thinking about that as OTs, because it's hammered into us from day one in OT school. It's hard. It can be really hard to do when you're very busy, but it's absolutely critical. And remember, it leads to new synapses. What did you say?
The nervous system's more turned on. Motivation,
Absolutely.
They're just turned on. They're fired up.
Oh. On the boundaries. Okay, so the boundaries to sensory integration theory and practice. Population boundaries. So Ayer's SI theory was intended to explain mild to moderate problems in learning and behavior, to explain motor coordination that can't be explained by frank neurologic insult or abnormality, that it was related to impairments in central processing of sensation. And a diagnosis of sensory integrative dysfunction requires evidence of deficits in central processing of vestibular, proprioceptive, or tactile sensation that are not attributable to frank peripheral or central nervous system damage. And Sharon and Bridget touched on this, but one of the things that you'll see in I have word finding problems, criticism of Ayer's work and the studies that have said that it's not efficacious is that they have very poor inclusion criteria. They're including subjects in their studies who don't have sensory integrative dysfunction by definition because they have other identifiable neurologic conditions. And they also, their treatment did not meet the expectations of the fidelity model. So that's what the treatment boundaries are related to. Enhanced sensation in the context of meaningful self-directed adaptive interactions. Emphasis on the integration of vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile sensations. AIR's sensory integration treatment is not sensory motor and not sensory stimulation. So that's not to say that there isn't some value in those other types of intervention, that there isn't some value in looking at other sensory systems. But remember, this project is about getting people all on board in understanding what AIR's SI theory was about. And she did speak some about these other sensory systems, but she was primarily focused on vestibular, proprioception, and tactile, a little bit on visual perceptual.
Okay, so then in conclusion, this is just looking at, if you'd like to review kind of where we got this information, these are all readings that are on the OT, the SI competency information, which is on the OT website under programmatic resource information, and then under that, go to sensory integration. And you can see the last two items on there are from the same book, so we did copy those specific pages onto there. And then the follow-up partnership activities is kind of your focus over the next couple months as your partners will be coming to your sites, is completing a treatment observation with your partner or videotape that session, working with your partner to determine what would the appropriate child be. You know, so many of our kids have comorbidities, so maybe they're not straight SI, but there's still things we can learn, whether or not that be feeding issues or, you know, and things that could be rooted in SI, or if there are other more complex kids. I still think that this is a time for collaboration where we can all work together, because I know it's hard to get your straight SI kids sometimes. And then focus on developing a hypothesis about the sensory integration deficits affecting the performance, and then identify and discuss the rationale for one related adaptive response and how you developed it or will develop the just right challenge to facilitate that response. You have anything to add?
I don't think so.
Okay, so we're ending a few minutes early, which is good. Thank you guys for your time. We are going to have this video put up on the website within the next week. And so if you do have any questions for either Robin or I, email us. If they're really neuro heavy, Robin's probably your person. But yeah, thank you very much.